So we heard your sister Lydia's story. I mean, it's kind of almost hard to fathom. Your mother has been spent 10 out of 23 odd years in prison in China. Lydia has been persecuted in various ways. She made it here. You've been persecuted yourself. Why don't you tell me the story of your family?
我们家是96年得法的，
My family
当时
started
我还是
practicing
很小。
Falun Gong in 1996, when I was still really young. Starting in 1999, when the Chinese regime started persecuting Falun Gong, all families who practiced Falun Gong were targeted by the regime. Throughout my childhood, my parents were repeatedly arrested and imprisoned. They went in and out of prison. I was very young at the time, and I would go visit my parents in prison with my sister. They were extremely frail and thin, and I could only imagine how they were being tortured and severely beaten while in prison. In 2008, I came to the US, and in 2009, I joined Shen Yun Performing Arts. My sister later told me that after the Chinese regime figured out I had joined Shen Yun Performing Arts, they put my sister and mother under constant surveillance, and they would threaten them to try to force them to share details about how I joined Shen Yun and about everything I was doing in the US. They were constantly monitored. And around 2011, my sister had just given birth to her first daughter. At the time, her daughter was only 3 months old. It was July, and my sister was taken by public security officials to a hotel at a university where she worked. She was carrying her daughter, and they held her there for an entire day and didn't give them any food or water. They kept interrogating her to find out about my exact whereabouts in the US and details of what I was doing. This is what my sister told me later. At the time, I was in the US and I couldn't communicate with my family in China. In 2009, my father, after being repeatedly tortured, he passed away in a hospital. I wasn't told about it until later because at the time in the hospital, my family was being constantly watched, so they couldn't communicate with me to tell me what happened. So it wasn't until November 2009, when the surveillance had loosened a tiny bit, was my mother able to actually tell me what happened, that my father had passed away.
Did they ever try to use your family to pressure you? Because I know of multiple examples of that having happened.
When
I first came to the US, I didn't have a fixed US phone number, so the CCP couldn't find me. But they knew I had joined Shen Yun Performing Arts, so they would instead go find my sister or my mother and threaten them. They would say, "Your son is abroad with Shen Yun. You must tell us everything about his activities." They will threaten them and say, "If you don't tell us everything, we will make you lose your job, or won't let you eat, or won't let you go home, or we'll keep you locked up." They would try to use whatever means possible to get any and all information they could about me and what I was doing with Shen Yun.
So why do you think the Chinese Communist Party is so obsessed with this dancer in America and Shen Yun?
Because Shen Yun Performing Arts mission is to revive traditional Chinese culture, whereas the CCP persecutes and destroys traditional Chinese culture. The regime fears traditional culture and values because it's a tyrannical regime. In reviving traditional Chinese culture, Shen Yun also shows some things that are happening in modern-day China, including the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. It will show such scenes of very evil things the CCP does not want other countries to know about. So that's why the CCP sees Shen Yun as the greatest thorn in its side, because Shen Yun promotes traditional values that are completely opposite to the values of the Chinese Communist Party, so they feel very threatened by Shen Yun.
So we're talking about how the CCP is this kind of obsession with Shen Yun. I understand they actually have been quite active outside of China, kind of interfering in Shen Yun's activities.
The Chinese regime has always felt extremely threatened by Shen Yun. So in the beginning, they sent a lot of Chinese performing arts groups to the US to compete with Shen Yun, and they claimed that they were presenting traditional Chinese values. But really, they were using art that had a lot of Communist Party culture and propaganda to confuse Americans. But they realized it wasn't working because nobody went to watch their shows, whereas Shen Yun's audiences kept growing. So they started writing letters and used other means to threaten and coerce theaters in different cities to try to make them block Shen Yun from performing in their theaters. But of course, the US is a free country. So many theaters didn't fall for these tactics, and they let Shen Yun perform anyway. Another thing is the CCP also often sends agents to harass Shen Yun performers. There have been many examples where their agents actually slashed the tires of Shen Yun touring buses so that our performers couldn't make it to the next stop where they were set to perform. And sometimes when we're on a tour, on our break days, when we go shopping at a mall, for instance, these agents will follow us around and taking photos and collecting intelligence on us. Even this year, they're still trying to obstruct and block Shen Yun performances. A few years ago in South Korea, we were supposed to perform in Seoul. But because of pressure and threats from the CCP, unfortunately, a few performances in Seoul were canceled because they wouldn't allow us to perform.